Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, December 5th. Happy December and happy Kislev. Kislev being the new Hebrew month that began just last week or earlier this week, I think. Yeah, a few days ago. Kislev is the month in which Hanukkah will be observed, this year falling what we Americans consider to be late, with the first candle being lit on the night of the 25th. So we get a Christmaka this year. And also at the darkest time of the year, don't we all need the lights of the festival? So happy to be here with you in the month of Kislev. Um, we're going to begin with a bracha, a blessing for study, and then resume our study from last week, which was on the subject of B'nai Mitzvah, Bar Mitzvah, the rite of passage that happens at the time, as we learned last week, of pubescence. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So I'm very happy to be with you. Last week we completed our mini unit on Brit Milah, on the covenant of circumcision shortly after birth. It was proposed to me, by the way, by one of our devoted students in this class, that a future course of study that would be interesting and meaningful would be to examine the ways in which modern times and modern or present day circumstances have adjusted and expanded the landscape of how Jewish communities and Jewish tradition marks life cycle time. So one example of that would be, while the Talmud does not discuss a correlated ritual for welcoming girls into the covenant, it is widespread practice within non-Orthodox Judaism to honor the arrival of a girl with a ceremony of naming and or something called a brit bat, where a covenant for a daughter, where there is, of course, no milah, no circumcision, no surgery practiced, but various Jewish rituals have been developed in order to honor the place of girls who are born into Jewish families as well. There are all sorts of new issues that pertain to children who are born through IVF or surrogacy, or who come into a family through adoption, and how the Jewish tradition has creatively responded to those developments is also worthy of our study. It's not the course of study that I've prepared for us this year, but the good news is there's always going to be something for us to learn. In the meantime, we're making this big leap, as we did at the end of the session that we concluded 2 weeks ago, taking a week off for Thanksgiving. On the subject of Brit Milah, we jumped 13 or 12 years forward to start looking at the ritual pertaining to Bar Mitzvah. Bat Mitzvah, again, one of those modern innovations in the Jewish tradition that is not discussed in the Talmud, though the Talmud does talk about both the period of adolescent maturity or sexual maturity, the onset of sexual maturity for both girls and boys. And we learned last time we were together 2 weeks ago that the Talmud recognizes the earlier maturation of girls by suggesting that 12 years old is the period of adult maturity for girls, whereas sexual maturity arrives for boys in the 13th year. So as a bit of a refresher, I'll show you where we were last time, and we'll just be able to pick right up. We were looking at Tractate Niddah. Niddah is the specific rabbinic word or Talmudic word for menstrual impurity, and all of the rules and rituals that appertain thereto. So the all the rituals and rules pertaining to menstrual impurity are covered in the tractate called Niddah, and therefore it's somewhat tangential, but you can probably guess the correlation why the Talmud would at a certain point in this tractate also give us the proof text, or the core text on puberty and how we associate this time in a child's life with quote unquote adulthood. But what we're really going to look at today, in continuation of our conversation, is the what do we mean when we talk about adulthood? Are we talking only about physical maturation, or is there more? So the passages we looked at last week, starting with the Mishnah from Niddah 45b, states that with regard to a girl who was 11 years old and one day, so in other words, not on the birthday itself, but the day after the birthday, her vows are examined. Meaning, if a young woman, and I'm going to call her a young woman as opposed to a girl, because that's kind of the point, to ascertain whether or not she is aware of the meaning of her vow and in whose name she vowed. We talked last week. If you didn't see it, go back and review the YouTube video. That vowing is taken with a religious seriousness in both biblical and rabbinic tradition. It's the heart of the third commandment, thou shalt not take God's name in vain. Has to do not with uttering swear words so much as with swearing oaths on the name of God. To take an oath and invoke the name of a deity imbued the oath with a kind of sacred power, and underscored that this promise was not to be broken under whatever penalty might be stipulated, whether actual or spiritual, very much akin to the way in which those who testify in court cases are asked to place their hands on a religious text, usually a Bible, and swear an oath that they're going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Very same idea here. So they say that between the ages of 11 years and one day for a girl and 12 years old, the vows are in a kind of, liminal period where you have to check every time a girl says, I swear on the name of Yahweh, or Adonai to do such and so or thus and such. And they are kind of provisionally accepted. And then after the age of 12 years old and one day, and you notice that Steinsaltz, this isn't in the text itself, adds, has grown two pubic hairs, which is the sign of physical maturation, the onset of secondary sex characteristics, and therefore puberty. Then her vows take effect. In other words, we trust that a young woman of 12 years old who has arrived at the age of physical maturation, of puberty, that she has an adult understanding of what she's talking about when she makes a promise. And therefore, this is about both physical maturity, but also, I would say, spiritual maturity in a sense. And we're going to talk about all these different ways of understanding what we mean when we talk about maturity. As for where Steinsaltz gets this two pubic hairs, because it seems to be just kind of plucked, pun intended, sorry folks, out of nowhere, we can cross-reference another passage in the Babylonian Talmud, which will be the first new text we're looking at today. So we said a blessing, right? Okay, thought so. Ditanya, as it was taught in a Baraita, that's the formula for introducing an extra Mishnaic or a Mishnaic era supplementary text that is not in the Mishnah itself, but is used for arguing in the Talmud. Ditanya, ben tesha shanim shehevi shtei se'arot. So a son, a boy of 9 years old, who has brought forth hevi shtei se'arot, two hairs. And they don't mean hairs on the head, of course. They're talking about two pubic hairs, but euphemistically, it is couched in this more kind of ordinary language of just two hairs. Shuma, that is considered to be a mole. Why? Because the child of 9 years old is a priori disqualified from being considered pubescent. Now, modern medical science, as I understand it, suggests that there are cases, and in fact, there's a proliferation of such cases in more recent times of much earlier onset puberty. Probably Aaron could comment most effectively on that since you work in pediatric medicine. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but it's even coming up in the case that is before the Supreme Court, about whether or not to deny coverage for transgender medical care. I don't know. I've heard about this literally just this morning on the New York Times audio.
Yes, you are correct. The average age of puberty has been decreasing, and different communities have pubertal changes at different ages too. So, like the African American community tends to reach maturity younger.
And is that, does anyone know why? Biological, nutritional,
The
hormonal?
oh, okay. So someone probably knows why better than I do. Overarching though, in the average age for all girls decreasing is concern about hormones in the foods we eat.
Yeah, that was what I thought, but didn't want to state without the authority to state so.
I am not an endocrinologist, so there may be newer science or some more interesting things out there, but that was my last understanding of it.
Well, I have an email thread going about something completely unrelated with a congregant who's also an endocrinologist, so maybe I'll ask her as well. We'll get the full scoop for next time.
Um,
In the meantime, the Talmud disqualifies the consideration that a 9-year-old would have hit puberty. So they say, no, no, no. If you see something that looks like hair down there, it's the same. We treat it like hair growing out of a mole. However, between the ages of 9 and 12, if the hairs are still on him and have not fallen out, this is still considered a mole. So they're saying we really aren't talking about pubescence and the onset of pubescence until the age of 13. So you can see Rabbi Yossi says it is a sign indicating puberty, which means that there's a dispute or debate over what about between the ages of 9 and 12. Could that be puberty? Definitely everyone agrees after the age of 13 that if you have hair down there, that is definitely a sign that puberty has arrived. I bring this text only to show you that Steinsaltz is not just deriving this criterion out of thin air, but rather has a textual source well attested in this and I believe other places in the Talmud to quote unquote prove or that's this is the litmus test in the rabbinic community to know when a child has or has not reached puberty. Um, that's what we looked at last time. And just as a refresher, the text went on in the text we were just looking at a moment ago in Niddah to propose that it's 12 and a day for girls with the simanim, which is the euphemistic word that means hairs, but it literally means signs. So there's a physical sign of maturity. And then for boys, 13 years and 1 day. Um, Now, interestingly, the conditions that surround physical maturation are only the beginning of our conversation about how we understand the time in a child's life when he or she is to be considered an adult within the Jewish community. So I had a text up here, and it looks like I might have messed up. So hang on for a second. I tried to get all of my tabs in order before beginning our text. So the one I wanted to look at, right. I think we looked at this as well. Uh, yes, we looked at this as well from Bava Metzia, uh, Tractate Bava Metzia, page 96a. And then here, as Safaria enumerates paragraph number 22, we looked at this paragraph up here, which talks about who is obligated to do mitzvot. This has nothing to do with bar mitzvah. I brought this last week because it is the first place that we find the term bar mitzvah brought in the Talmud. I've highlighted it right here, where the translation that is provided, I think it's a good translation, a good idiomatic translation, is one who is obligated to do mitzvot. Now, in this case, they're talking about slaves versus freemen. So is a slave bar mitzvah? And they don't mean is a slave a person who has had an aliyah to the Torah. That's not in any way considered. They mean is a Hebrew slave, a member of the Jewish community, but who has indentured himself to a family to usually to pay off a debt. Most slavery that the Torah is concerned with, at least as a matter of ethical and legal principle for the Israelite community, is debt slavery. People who would basically indenture themselves or be indentured to a household for a certain, usually limited period of time, often with their family. I'm making all of these notations and conditions to differentiate Israelite debt slavery from the connotations and associations that most of us have when we talk about slavery, where we think either through our Jewish lens of Egyptian bondage or through our American eyes of African enslavement of Africans in the Americas. The Israelite slavery is generally considered to be of a different nature, though again, I'm not a pro-slavery rabbi. I'm merely suggesting that when we talk about the kind of slavery that the Torah is concerned with, it had to do usually with a kind of indentured status, usually to pay off a debt that had accumulated. Um, and therefore, in this passage from Bava Metzia in the Babylonian Talmud, the term bar mitzvah is used to describe the condition of one who is subject to the obligation of performing mitzvot. So if that is you, if that describes you, you are called bar mitzvah, literally one who is subject to mitzvot. I don't like the hyper literal translation. You are now a son of the commandments. That's not idiomatic to what the term bar mitzvah really means. Bar mitzvah means obligated to do mitzvot, obligated to the commandments. And that really makes a lot of sense. On the same measures we saw from Niddah, we would not obligate a young person who cannot understand the meaning of a vow or a promise and the seriousness with which those were taken to be subject to the mitzvot of Jewish tradition. So this goes beyond, as I've said, physical maturity to really get into the question of, well, does this person have the sechel, the intellectual and moral awareness to be subject to a tradition of law, obedience, and mitzvot? Questions on any of that so far, most of which I framed as a recap of where we were 2 weeks ago. And if you want the more elaborate thing, you can go back to like the last half hour of our session, which is recorded on YouTube. Mom and Dad, you've got a hand up, please.
Um, Apropos of your last comment, you personally being the uncle of some children who, although they will achieve maturity, will never have the capacity to be obligated to the mitzvah.
Yeah, excellent point of view. And we just did a couple weeks before Thanksgiving observe a B'nai Mitzvah ritual for my parents' grandchildren, Kelly and my niece and nephew, my sister's younger kids, twins, Jacob and Shira. So Jakey and Shira uh, are children who live with cerebral palsy, and so they lack the intellectual awareness to be subject to mitzvot. They don't use language to talk, though they have their ways of communicating. They don't dress or feed or toilet themselves. They walk with assistive devices when they move about. So it's actually a really interesting question, and yet I haven't gotten into the weeds with this question with you guys, with mom and dad, with my sister Becky. I do not know if they have arrived at the place of physical maturity. It looks like they're on the cusp of puberty, but chronologically, they are both 13. They turned 13 on October 28th. So the rabbis of of Bethel Synagogue Center, the conservative shul in New Rochelle, and I were, and my family, of course, were all overjoyed to celebrate a ritual honoring their place as quote unquote adult members of the Jewish community nonetheless. Because I think the understanding was that they should not be excluded from their membership in the community of the adult Jewish people, even though we couldn't fulfill the traditional practices around this time in their lives, which would include an aliyah to the Torah. And we're going to look at some of that. Like, why do these become the signposts of having arrived at Jewish maturity? Why not something else? Why not feats of strength or, a sparring contest of some kind to show that a child has arrived at a stage of maturity, the way other tribes and communities may signal the rite of passage from childhood to adulthood?
I'm also reminded from the Haggadah of the four children and the child who does not have the capacity to ask, and
Lovely.
how that's still an inclusive part of the Seder.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for articulating these nuances and shades of gray that reside within the Jewish tradition. That on the one hand, there are questions about intellectual capacity when it comes to readiness to declare a child a bar mitzvah. Nonetheless, there is an overarching stance within the Jewish tradition of inclusion toward all, regardless of ability or disability. And I think that, in particular, Reform Judaism or non-Orthodox Judaism has taken great efforts, pains in recent years to be more thoughtful and nuanced in our approach to inclusion, mindful that we are all made in the image of God, whatever way we present ourselves in the world. And that, I believe, is an overarching Jewish value to which the idea of a ritual of bar mitzvah in the traditional way, come up and say a bunch of Hebrew words and read from the Torah scroll, are actually subjugated, right? So that would be lower in my totally, subjective scale of what matters most in Judaism. I would say the principle you've articulated, that every child, regardless of ability, disability, or the way one presents in the world, has a place at the table of the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. And that I've arrived at that position not just through my study of the tradition, but also through living in Jewish community and meeting many kids who are neurodivergent or physically, live with disabilities, and also from our own family situation. Thank you for raising that. That's poignant for me. Okay, so moving forward in our text, Mishnah Avot, we have studied this. Well, those of you who've been on the long journey of study for the last several years, we did a comprehensive top to bottom study of Pirkei Avot, the chapters of our ancestors, or what may equally have been meant to say Pirkei Avot, meaning the master chapters of the Jewish tradition, though sometimes it is called the chapters of our fathers and the ethics of our fathers, lots of different ways of translating this. It's sort of the Poor Richard's Almanac of Judaism. It is a six-chapter collection of wisdom statements, aphorisms, and as I attempted to make the case, and all of this is available on our YouTube channel if you want to go back into the deep dive. Pirkei Avot is a wonderful, eternally relevant text. So you can always return to it again and again and find new meaning because we change, though the text does not. So Pirkei Avot was also, I believe, a handbook by rabbis for rabbis on how to be rabbis, how to teach, how to adjudicate a community, how to conduct oneself with rectitude and wisdom and rabbinic leadership, as this was a kind of embryonic idea at the time. So that is the context in which we arrive at chapter 5, teaching number 21. And you just have to go back a little bit to see who the speaker is. So we're reading from the wisdom of Rabbi Judah ben Tema, Yehuda ben Tema. As we see here, always good to click. In Sefaria, you can see that he was a Tana, so a Mishnaic era teacher of the 4th generation, the first part of the 2nd century of the Common Era, and helpfully we learn not much is known about him. But apparently he was a respected dude who studied under the great Yehuda Hanasi. So let's see what Yehuda ben Tema said in the text that I've brought for consideration. Hu haya omer, he used to say, ben chamesh shanim lamikra. So one who is 5 years old, ben chamesh shanim, one of 5 years, lamikra, is ready for scripture. In other words, this is when one should start studying Torah and Tanakh, when one should start studying the Hebrew Bible. Ben Eser la Mishnah. At the age of 10, one is ready to study, or one begins to study Mishnah. Ben Shlosh la Mitzvot. At the age of 13, la mitzvot. Now, there's no verb here, which is really interesting. It just says, I mean, if you were being really literal, it says, Haya Omer, he used to say, Ben chamesh shanim la mikra. At 5 years, for scripture. At 10 years, for Mishnah. At 13 years, for mitzvot. And I could stop there, but I'll continue. Ben chamesh esrei la Talmud, at 15 years for Talmud. Ben shmoneh esrei la chuppah, at 18 years for the chuppah, for marriage. Ben esrim lirdof, at 20 to pursue, probably meaning a livelihood. Ben shloshim la koach, at 30 for strength. I'm not sure what that means. Ben arba'im la bina, at 40 for understanding. Ben chamishim la etza, at 50 for counsel. Ben shishim la zikna, at 60 for old age. Ben shiv'im la seva, at 70 for really old age. Well, seva kind of means fullness of years. Ben shmonim la gvura, and then all of a sudden, if you make it to 80 for strength, it says. Ben tish'im la suach. At 90, interestingly, la suach, I would translate meaning for discourse. They say a bent body. This is a strange word. I'm surprised there isn't a gloss there. I'd have to go and do a deeper dive to figure it out. Ben Me'ah, at 100, ke'ilu met, as if already dead, v'avar uvatel min ha'olam, and has passed and been negated from the world. Gone as good as dead and gone completely out of the world. Shabbat shalom. Sorry, folks. For those of you who
with that.
Yeah, you may take umbrage at that, Len. I don't dispute. Which is why we don't really have to get into that today. Let's consider only the quick phrase that I brought for the purpose of our study about bar mitzvah. Here we have a correlated text to our mini unit here on bar mitzvah that suggests that at age 13 one is ready for mitzvot. So this is often brought as one of the signature texts of what is bar mitzvah in the Jewish tradition. How do we understand this time in a child's life? At the age of 13, one is ready for the performance of commandments, or one can understand the concept of obligation, and so on and so forth. I don't know if there's much else to say that, but this is one of, I would say, early Judaism's greatest hits passages where you can kind of memorize, okay, what does each age and stage of a life as understood by the Jewish tradition offer? At 5, one studies Bible. At 10, Mishnah. At 13, one takes on mitzvot. At 15, Talmud, and so forth. And what's really interesting is that all of the first several, I think, have to do with text and tradition and the training of a child to be a Jew. And then at 18, it says, then you get married, and then the next one at 20 is a livelihood, and all of the things that we would kind of like separate out from our Jewish upbringing. It's like then it's about making a living and making a life. But the rooting, the upbringing is all about how you indoctrinate or train a child to be fully within the Jewish tradition. So Aaron, who today is identified as Ellie's iPad, unmute yourself, please.
I think your word indoctrination is such an interesting choice because the way that paragraph reads, that's what you're doing. You're teaching them to follow rules without teaching them why. And the meaning and the understanding, which I would argue are the most important part of doing anything ever, don't come until you're 3 times as old. And after you've already started indoctrinating a new generation. I find that really striking.
Beautiful observation. I'm just going to say, I think you're speaking in a way that is true to the intention of the text. And the order, by the way, Bible first, then Mishnah. And remember, Mishnah, although it is dialectical in that different rabbis are cited and arguments are presented, the Mishnah is much more streamlined in terms of here's how one as a Jew knows what one is supposed to do, as opposed to what we're learning, which is Talmud, which is much more expansive. And one can easily leave an extended passage of Talmud more confused about, well, now what am I supposed to do? I've now been, I've been swimming in this murk of 10 different rabbis with all of their different opinions, and no firm resolution is provided. Lots of interesting conversation, discourse, and argument, but where does this leave me? It would take Maimonides and his uh, similarly minded uh, Jewish exponents of law who in the Middle Ages would say, let's make a code. Let's reduce down the discursive nature of the Talmud to simple principles. But in terms of like what are the first years of a child's life all about? At least up until 13, it's about, I think it is about indoctrination. And then at 13, when one can, take on mitzvot for oneself and develops, I think, the intellectual capacity and sophistication to reason, to really reason much more like a grown-up, then you're ready for Talmud at 15. And then only after that are you ready for life choices, like really important life decisions. Barbara points out very interesting observation as well that parenthood is not mentioned. So again, yeah, I think you've pointed out something really fascinating about this text, though I don't know why. Is it an omission, deliberate or accidental? I do not know.
Does
Russell.
any,
Oh, Erin. Yep.
does anyone else find that unsettling?
Okay, Russell's nodding vigorously. So Russell, take the floor, please.
Well, I have two comments. One of which is a follow-on to Aaron's very thoughtful, provocative, and I think correct observation. The first is that the first stage of life that they describe is the study of Scripture. And yet those 5-year-olds who study Genesis will learn that Sarah was 120 years old when she gave birth to Isaac. So my first question is, do the rabbis attempt to tie these age designations and these age categories to the very fantastical ages that are given us in Scripture? But my second question is that looking at the later stages of life, I look around me and I know plenty of people, no matter what their age, who are never in a position to dispense wisdom, who are never valid counselors. And I know plenty of people in their 80s and 90s who I think would probably qualify for the younger ages. So is this really meant just to establish certain presumptions that preserve hierarchy and power more than making a practical or useful suggestion as to how we should live our lives and how we should treat one another?
Thank you. My answers to your questions, which are two long form questions, are in the order you presented them, no and yes. So the second question, taking up the second question, I think that these are intended to be aspirational or prescriptive rather than descriptive of, what we see in the real world. I think that is intended to set a template for what the Jewish community hopes will be the cycle of life and how you will orient your life around core Jewish values: education, family, career, and then the acquisition and even dispensing of wisdom. I would say overarching is a prescription for a life of meaning and purpose within the confines of the early rabbinic tradition. Um,
And
Also,
where it does Tikkun Olam enter into this? Is
not into this formulation. It's really interesting. It really doesn't talk about the performance of mitzvot that benefit one's character or one's community. It does not give priority to what I would consider to be ethics, the consideration of what is right and what is wrong, though it may assume that by assimilating that much, Torah knowledge, where Torah doesn't just mean the five books of Moses, but accumulated Jewish wisdom, one is bound to be a person of rectitude anyway. I think these are all assumptions one can make. The only other thing I'll go back to is what I advised when I introduced Pirkei Avot this morning, which is that I really believe this is a training manual by rabbis for rabbis. So we may not be talking about any person, but specifically this is what is prescribed for the rabbi. Right? This is what we want the teacher and exemplar of Jewish life, learning, and character example to be. The exemplar for the Jewish community should root himself, it would be him, in the texts and traditions, and then pursue a suitable wife and a career, which, by the way, we've studied this before. Rabbi was not a career, not in a paying sense. Rabbi was a vocation, but it was not one that was expected to put food on the table. So you would have to have a career, and you could be elevated as a rabbi by virtue of your learning and your qualifications to serve the Jewish community. I forget what the first question was. It was a great one, and I remember just thinking, no, the answer to that one is no.
The first was whether or not this is meant to be in any way connected to the very
Right.
fantastical ages
I don't
given
think
to
so.
our
I don't
patriarchs.
think so. And as a general rule, the rabbinic literature, except in some of the Midrash, the rabbinic literature, when it talks about ages, it really means like the way we think of ages, more or less. Whereas the Bible clearly has some kind of like fable conceit or orientation as a literature that, for whatever reason, the Bible, the book of Genesis in particular, is littered with people who are superannuated in ways that just stretch credulity, right? Like a Methuselah of 969 years old. Well, that's preposterous in terms if a year really means a year. Not that you can't live that long. So, but the rabbis seem to dispense with that altogether and have I think when they say no, 5 years really means 5 years, and at 100 years, it's amazing if you're still alive, but you're as good as dead, which would be extremely rare. I mean, it wasn't until I think the 19th century that life expectancy jumped to like 40. So, and then progressively, this was just on the news the other day, has steadily increased. Uh, I know what it was in. I was listening to an audiobook of Carl Sagan's last book, which was called The Demon Haunted World, which was published posthumously in 1995, I think. And he was talking about advances in medical science that have now made it possible to live miraculously into one's 70s and 80s. But this was for the vast majority of the existence of our species, Homo sapiens, it was not expected that you would live into your 30s. So, anyway. Okay, Michelle Braun, you've had your hand up for a while. But fortunately, it's a digital hand, so no strain.
I could be screened. No. I just wanted to observe, I think the items listed are all things that require intentional action. You have to teach this, you have to be taught this, you have to choose to do this, you have to choose to get married, you have to choose to, and so they are all things that take action. It does not include things that are going to happen on their own. And that's why I think parenthood is not mentioned, because once we're married, this is just going to happen.
Uh-huh.
But
Right.
then you do have to be reminded you have to make a living because now you have a family to support.
Nice way of thinking through this. Yep. If the text could be augmented with, Rav Michelle, I think that you'd have a reasonable supposition to bring. Okay, one more comment from Aaron, and then we'll proceed.
Well, I kind of have an opposing but interesting view compared to Michelle, who sees this all as intentional. And I think going back to my original comment, in traditional or more observant Judaism, it isn't intentional. It is prescribed. And even, for a woman, there's no choice in marriage. That isn't an intent she has to take on.
Right. Thank you. Hard to look at these texts without prejudging them through our 21st century non-Orthodox American lens, uh, and just sort of like suspend as much judgment as we can to really inhabit the world in which these texts were developed and for the communities that they were developed. Um, Full stop on that sentence. Appreciate your insights. Okay, so what I'm going to bring up now is something we haven't seen before, which is an extra-Talmudic tractate. So in addition to the authorized tractates of the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, or what's sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, having nothing to do with today's Palestinian community, but rather the Talmud that was written in Roman-controlled Palestine in the early centuries of the Common Era, meaning after Jesus. Um, in addition to the tractates that are authorized to be included in the Talmuds, we also have a number of extra-Talmudic tractates, which are contemporaneous both in provenance, geographically, and in era. But for whatever reason, one has to make certain conjectures about the process of redaction and who had political influence to surmise why certain texts were in certain tractates were included and certain were not. Such knowledge escapes me, and to my best understanding, there's no scholarly consensus on why exactly certain tractates are included and others are not. One of the most famous illustrations of what I'm describing is a tractate that's all about death and burial, and for whatever reason is not included in the Babylonian Talmud, but is considered to be an extra Talmudic tractate. One can access these texts, and Safari makes it very easy to find them. Another one is Tractate Sofrim, which nominally is about writing text itself, but is like most Talmudic literature or Talmudic era literature, is highly discursive and kind of flows by free-flowing random association. That's probably enough to get us into the text. So there's this passage from Tractate Sofrim, section 18, chapter 18, verse or paragraph 5. Even Jay, do you want to chime in on something related to this? You put your hand up, so I will lower it. Okay. V'chein haya minhag tov b'Yerushalayim. I'm reading from right here. There used to be a nice custom. Even Jay, you just raised your hand again. Do you want to say something? Okay, no. All right. There used to be a nice custom, a minhag tov, in Jerusalem, lehit anot b'neihem uvenotehem. Okay, so lehit anot means to afflict, but it is also a word that is directly derived from Leviticus chapter 16, which describes the ancient Yom Kippur. Even Jay, you keep raising your hand. Is everything okay? I want to acknowledge your hand every time
The
it goes up.
computer, don't. The computer is doing it itself. I don't
Oh,
know
fun
why.
times. All right, you have a
Sort of like
poltergeist.
your balloons.
Yes, exactly. You have a Jewish poltergeist. Okay. It must be interpreting something in your backdrop as a raised hand, which I don't understand. But there you go. Okay, so it used to be a nice custom in Jerusalem, and I like how or a good custom. In the translation here, they're going to say a beautiful custom. Lehitanot, which means to afflict oneself. Lehitanot from inui, where in the Torah, the book of Leviticus talks about the Day of Atonement as a time for inui nefesh, for afflicting one's body or afflicting oneself. Benehem, or benehem, meaning their sons, uvenotehem, and their daughters, hakitanim, the young ones, biyom tzom, on a fast day. Ben Yud Aleph Shana, Ben Achatisrei Shana, which means at the age of 11 years, ad etzem hayom ben shtemesrei, up until the very day of the 12th birthday, lahashlim. Okay, so I'm gonna go to the translation here. There was likewise a beautiful custom in Jerusalem to train. I disagree with that translation. If you click there, it'll say inserted by Gra, M, and H, who are different translators here. I don't think this has to do with training at all, but in a sense it does. To train their young sons and daughters to afflict themselves on a fast day. I see what they're driving at here. Okay. They're not talking about training them in any way other than introducing their kids of 11 years old to the idea of fasting. Not to the idea of fasting, but to the practice of fasting. At the age of 11 to the middle of the day, and at the age of 12 to the full day. At the age of 13, the boy was taken round and presented to every elder to bless him and pray that he may be worthy to study the Torah and engage in good deeds, where I'm sure the word for good deeds is mitzvot, but I want to check it. But Torah, nope, it says masim tovim, literally good deeds. So what's being described here? They're saying on a fast day, if you have an 11-year-old kid up until the at the age of 11, a child would be expected to fast until lunchtime. And at the age of 12, the child who was being introduced to fasting as a Jewish practice the whole day. And then at the age of 13, you would present the child to the elders for a blessing and prayers that he would be worthy of Torah study and engaging in good deeds. And it goes on to describe the custom. In like manner, everyone who had a man superior to him in the town would rise from his place and go and bow down to him, requesting that he pray on his behalf. So there seems to be this kind of veneration of the elders. This is meant to teach us that they, meaning the men of Jerusalem, were splendid men, and their deeds were splendid or commendable, and that their hearts were directed toward heaven, which is simply a euphemistic way of talking about religious piety. Furthermore, they did not leave their young children behind, but took them to the synagogue to encourage them in the performance of the precepts. So what's being described here is the idea of, I would say, gradualism in marking a child's maturity from childhood to adulthood. And you notice that the signposts that are brought in this text are the ritual of fasting or the Jewish practice of fasting and the training up or encouragement of the study of Torah and the performance of good deeds. So you have three different categories of Jewish life and practice that are being introduced to children from a young age, but there's a gradualism starting at age 11 where, particularly on the ritual stuff, like fasting, that the child would be expected to try it for a half day, and then the next year, try it without culpability for a full day, and then starting at 13, be held responsible for fulfilling the practice. How many of you, when you raised your kids in a Jewish way, did this either exactly or something like it? Introduced your kids to fasting in a gradual way. Does anyone want to comment? Because I've seen more than a couple hands go up. All right, so that's in other words, this I think is widespread. I know that that's what was done in my household. That, before, yeah, my dad's thumbing up on this one. That, before the age of bar mitzvah, fasting was sort of a try it before you buy it because, hey, kid, this is going to be you next year. And by the way, parents don't like it when their kids are like eating Cheerios while they're fasting. So I remember that starting by probably the age of 11 or so, my sister and I, each when we reached that age, were expected like, hey, we're skipping breakfast today. And you can come home after services, and we would start going to the adult services then. I guess in these texts, it's assumed that all the services are adult services. There's no such thing as a Tat Shabbat in the Talmud. But you gradually introduce your kids to the way in which Jewish people practice their tradition, including the hard stuff, right? And fasting is conventionally brought as the kind of key example of this is the hard stuff about being Jewish. Like this isn't fun, but it is serious, and we take it seriously. But we're not going to just drop it on you the minute you become a bar mitzvah. So I have a lot of kids who get up there on the beam on their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah and say, and now that I'm a bar mitzvah, I will have to, and they always say, fast on Yom Kippur, come to more services, and clean my room when asked, or just clean my room without being asked. Like somehow that's like the new thing. I don't know if that's probably not just a Scarsdale thing. That's just what kids associate with the burdensome parts of being a Jewish adult. It's like, yeah, I guess I have to help out more. Or some kids say I have to help out more around the house, or I have to be nice to my sister, or whatever the case may be. Audrey, chime in, please. Unmute.
I started fasting much earlier. I think my mother made it, a contest between what she did and what we had to do. But
Now, I
very,
remember your mother,
yeah,
and this strikes me as on brand for
yeah,
Hilda Forsheimer. May her soul be blessed.
right. She needs
But
it.
I imagine that she was like, yeah, she wasn't a lot of monkey business.
No,
Yeah.
no. And so I think I fast, and she told me, I don't know, 11 or 12, she had fasted the whole day. So you can be sure I beat her by a year, just so I would remain even, never better, but even. And so, yeah, I've been fasting all my life. But my granddaughter did exactly what you described as prescribed in the Talmud. She did that.
Right. So it's kind of fun to discover. I assume most parents who do this are doing it just intuitively, or because it's the practice they remember from their upbringing. But it's kind of fun to find a Talmudic warrant for this way of introducing kids to the ritual of fasting. And I don't want to make fasting the end all be all of how we understand the arrival at the period of Jewish maturity that we call bar mitzvah. It's also about knowledge of Torah and Maasim Tovim, the performance of good deeds. And I think they're presented on an equal playing field here, that it is about the ritual of fasting, but there's also an understanding that at 13, one is really committed to a life of Torah study and righteous deeds, righteous living. Judy Gross, please.
When I was studying for my adult bat mitzvah, I said, wow, this is wasted on 13-year-olds because you can't. I was so in love with the study and thinking the ritual I can understand, learning how to fast, learning certain things that are within the age level of truly understanding, but really going into Torah and discussing that you do it at a certain level, but it's not anywhere near what one can get out of that kind of study as you age. And I was way into those older ages when I was bat
Well,
mitzvah.
two critical points to underscore. One, it has always been permissible, if not encouraged, but certainly permissible within the Jewish tradition to observe bar or bat mitzvah in a ritual sense, including the study and the good deeds at any age after physical maturation at age 12 or 13. Right. So my mom celebrated her bat mitzvah as an adult as well at, I think, 42. So I remember because I was 16 at the time. So we from time to time have celebrated adult bat and bar mitzvah at WRT, and we've been having a conversation because a few people have presented themselves and said, "Oh, I never had a bat mitzvah as a youth. I'd like to." And I say mostly bat because for generations women were not really considered equal to this ritual. And therefore, in many communities, even, synagogue affiliated families, the boys would have a bar mitzvah, but the girls would not have a bat mitzvah. That generation largely has come and gone. And so most of the people in our WRT community who have wanted an adult bat mitzvah have had one. It was very prevalent throughout the 90s and early 2000s because these are women who were girls in the 50s and 60s. Starting in the later 70s or even in the mid 70s, all the way on through the present day, it was much more common for girls who were raised in Jewish families to have a ritual of bat mitzvah. And therefore, the demand for adult bat mitzvah has actually gone way down in synagogues, including our own. But there's still a trickle. And there are still men and women who converted to Judaism or for whatever reason they grew up in a non-observant family entirely, but have married somebody who now, as a family, they affiliated WRT, and they say, you know what? We're raising the kids to have a bar and bat mitzvah. Why don't I have one too? So we've been hearing some, chatter from different members of our community who, as adults, are saying, "Hey, would you ever do an adult bat mitzvah?" So Kenner Kleinman and Rabbi Plakow and I are all talking in recent weeks about starting a new adult bar and bat mitzvah process. If you yourself or someone you know or love would like to or would be interested in adult bat mitzvah, who's a member of our WRT community, please put them in touch with us because we'd like to collect a list. If we're going to devote a lot of time and energy to this, because it is a big project for the synagogue to run, we'd rather do it for a nice group of people and not just one or two. Privately, one or two people will train. Anyway, I believe that, bar and bat mitzvah is the closest that we have in the Jewish tradition. All of these life cycles are like sacraments in the Catholic tradition, and therefore access to them should be universal for anyone who wants them. But in the case of bar and bat mitzvah, there's a lot of training that goes into it. You can't just step up to a bima having no knowledge of the tradition. So you really need to learn. And in order to learn, you need to be taught. Let's see. Mom and Dad's hands are up next, please.
Nice segue into what I want to bring up, which is when we were talking about indoctrination of Jewish education, could you maybe comment on, I guess it's probably the ultra Orthodox. Isn't there a tradition when the 5-year-old sits down to the first text to either drop a candy or a coin or some honey or something like that? Could you elaborate on that a little
Absolutely. I mean, it's widely practiced in the Haredi world and the Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Jews who aren't even like, necessarily Payas Black Hat, though I would say in the Payas Black Hat community, it is widespread to begin a child's study of Torah at the age of 5. Um, so with Vayikra, by the way, and they memorize the lines. But even before that, kids as young as age 1 or 2 are introduced to Hebrew letters by writing them in sand or clay, and then putting honey in the rivulets, and then letting a child trace the outline of Hebrew letters and taste the honey. And the idea is to create a kind of Pavlovian association with learning Jewish text is sweet. And it's still practiced. It's very widespread. I've always thought we should do stuff like that in the JLL. Like I think it's just a lovely custom of teaching your kids at a very young age to think of learning not as a chore, but as a delicious privilege. Audrey.
Have you ever had the situation where you've bar bat mitzvahed a parent along with a younger, a 13-year-old?
Yes, though usually the parent would read only a handful of verses and we would, sing some, they would do an aliyah to the Torah, they'd chant a handful of verses, they might speak a few words of Torah, but even those parents who have wanted to be acknowledged for reaching bar and bat mitzvah don't want to overshadow the kids on their big day. So for reasons that have nothing to do with the tradition, but I think just out of sensitivity to is how this moment is interpreted in the present day community, our community, parents don't want their kids to feel like, Mom, like, come on, this day isn't about you. So, but you can make a really fun, I think, comedy about it. I think that would be a great plot point in the
You
next
should
Adam
do it.
Sandler movie. Okay.
You should do it.
All right, so let's proceed a little bit. So anyway, this was all just a way of looking at a text that suggests even more about what this age and stage of a child's life ought to mean to the child and the Jewish community, and the ways in which the Jewish community acknowledges a child's arrival at an age and stage of life that, as we saw, at first has to do with simple chronology and physical maturation, but now is expanding to mean the ability to understand the impact of one's own decisions, the willingness to take on mitzvot, the willingness to take on those difficult practices of Jewish life, which are sacred, like fasting, but to do so in a gradual way, a commitment from an early age, but that is reinforced at 13 to a life of Torah study, and no less important, the performance of good deeds. Like all of this stuff now is kind of aggregating around the age of physical maturity. Michelle.
Okay, two things. First of all, Judy Lass has been waving her hand.
Oh, okay. I didn't see it.
So, but now that I've recognized, I'm going to get my comment in, which is simply to ask if this is to revise or override the biblical rules that says that a woman can't make vows because they or a woman's vows are basically overruled by either or have to be approved by either a father or a husband.
I think absolutely. I think I'd have to go and do a little bit more homework to substantiate it, but I think that on its face, that's exactly what it appears to be, is that the rabbis are actually creating opportunities for the vow of a young woman to be taken with the same seriousness as the vow of a boy, of a young man. 100%. Okay. Judy Lass, unmute yourself, please.
If I may, I had two thoughts that I was
Please.
listening. Judy, I think, and Judy come from about the same generation because when I was growing up, women could not do very much in Judaism, and I have been a member of the Reform movement for just about ever in my lifetime. And as I got older, I became much more involved in Judaism because I had taken courses at NYU, and eventually I did want to study to be a rabbi, but women weren't rabbis. So I said, well, I have a good voice. Well, women aren't cantors. What I did do was apply to the Institute for Hebrew Religion. And interestingly enough, it was on West End Avenue. And I went for an interview and a whole series of things. And I did get accepted. And then someplace down the road, I don't know what happened, but I didn't follow through for some personal reasons. I wanted to be bat mitzvahed for years. So I've been at Westchester Reform since 1965, 66. So finally, of course, I wouldn't ask Jack Stern because he wasn't into it. But by the time it got to be Rick Jacobs, I spoke with him and he said, well, we're developing, interesting because it kind of hits your idea. We're developing a bat mitzvah class for people who didn't do it. And I can remember saying to Rick, I don't want to do it with a class. He said, well, we have a class coming. So I said, Rick, can I do it on a very quiet night in June, on a Friday night when there's my family there and not too many other people? And he said, sure. So I did a lot of work with Rick. And eventually I was bat mitzvahed by myself. But it was quite a challenge. So I can understand that Judy must have felt similarly because it was so evident in our generation. And I'm not the 70s, obviously. I was one of those 50 people and earlier, that you couldn't do it, that there was a definitive difference between your commitment and anybody else's that was a male. And I think as I got older, that was the piece I began to resent much, much, much more. So thank you, Judy.
Judy, that was an incredible sharing. I'm just so grateful. And some of it I knew and much of it I did not. So thank you.
Can I just add, there was a bat mitzvah class in Hartford, Connecticut. The conservative synagogue presented it. So in that case, I was already many, many hundreds of years ago, bat mitzvah, but you couldn't read from the Torah. And I was doing so much Torah study here at WRT. I said, I am going to go do this right. And I did, and I loved it. And I love cantillation, and I did present at my granddaughter's bat mitzvah. I read from the Torah. So anyway, it's been wonderful.
We're having like a dialogue between the two rabbis, Judy.
If I can just interfere for a second. when I decided that I wanted to study to be a rabbi, Barry was really very enthused. And one day I came home and on my kitchen table, which I have today in my china closet, is my Torah. He went out and he bought me a Torah. And it's been a wonderful thing. We take it out on holidays, and I gave it to my grandchildren. Actually, I to use in their about mitzvahs, and it's probably one of the most wonderful things. I take a look at it because I also wrote making a Torah when they had that at the temple. People scribed. So I just want to say that I feel very, very lucky to be with you people, and lucky, truthfully, to be able to learn more and more as long as I am alive. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. What an exemplary way of walking the walk. Anne?
I think I had a bad experience too when it came to bat mitzvah. I wanted a bat mitzvah, and I was told, you're a girl, you don't have to. And they refused. I was refused a bat mitzvah because I was a girl. And I, this wasn't the only occasion when being a girl was a problem for me. I didn't like being a girl, but things changed, and now I'm very happy to be a woman. But they said to me, you'll have a sweet 16 instead of a bat mitzvah. Well, to me, wasn't anything, it was so different. I
Right.
wasn't interested in a sweet 16. I wanted a bat mitzvah. But I think I just had, my ideas were different from my family's for some reason.
Well, they were also different at that time from at least a significant part of the Jewish community. We all owe a debt of gratitude to the family of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who's the father of Reconstructionist Judaism, who adamantly practiced bat mitzvah and insisted that his daughter also observe a bat mitzvah just as his son a bar mitzvah. And it was not mainstream. I mean, this is in the 1930s. It would take decades before it became mainstream. Again, I'm getting back to what I said before. Even in the Reform movement, bat mitzvah did not become a mainstay of Jewish practice until the late 60s. So most women, even in the Reform movement, certainly in conservative and absolutely in Orthodoxy, even in most Orthodox synagogues today, even if they do a ritual around bat mitzvah, and they call it that for girls. In some places, they don't call it that. They call it bat Torah or something else. But the girl reading from the actual Torah scroll is often restricted in today's Orthodox communities. The vast majority of, I think, all conservative and Reform communities, bar and bat mitzvah are equally practiced.
Well,
But it took a very long time for this practice to enter the Jewish cultural mainstream.
when I was going to synagogue when I was younger, I went by myself, not with my parents. Um, we weren't, the girls my age, I was a young teenager. I wasn't allowed to touch the Torah because I could be menstruating. And because of that, we weren't allowed to touch the Torah. And
Yep, I mean these do not surprise me, and yet and again I'm trying to practice what I preached a half hour ago, which was not to withhold our perspective of 21st century American, Reform Judaism and to impose it on earlier practices and teaching. Having said that, it still makes me sad the way in which obviously patriarchal codes of etiquette were imposed on the Jewish community and the Jewish tradition, and woven throughout, to the very much the detriment of women. So absolutely, the discrimination is built into the way the tradition has been understood. I also admire the flexibility and evolutionary capacity of the Jewish tradition to allow for a new way of understanding to take root and a new way of practicing to become widespread, such as bat mitzvah today. Um, what an interesting conversation. I'm going to take one more comment on this subject and then do a little more text. Sandy, please. Unmute yourself, please.
just to add to the anecdotal conversation, I was confirmed. I wore a black robe and I didn't have any Torah reading or Hebrew education in a Reform temple.
So this is widespread as well. And Michelle Braun put in the chat box for everyone to see that the major Reform synagogue in her community when she was a kid did not have bar or bat mitzvah. So her parents didn't join because that was obviously an incentive for your family. Did you join a conservative shul instead, Michelle? Was that what I seem to recall about your family story?
No, actually, the reason that my father really, really wanted to join that Reform congregation because the rabbi was a Rabbi Freehoff, who was one of the major intellects of
Solomon
the,
J.
I guess,
Freehoff, one of
Reform
the
movement at the time.
Yep.
And he had read a lot of his stuff and was very disappointed.
This is Road of Shalom in Pittsburgh.
Road of Shalom in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
And which I'm sorry, in my teens, we called it St. Rhodolph's.
Oh, yeah, sure.
They had Vesper services. They were not Christian, but they were on Sunday. I mean,
Yep.
we are trying to be mainstream Protestant, which is part of some aspects of classical Reform Judaism.
100%.
They had a terrible, religious school program. You didn't learn anything. Anyway, my parents ended up founding with a few other people a new congregation, which was eventually affiliated with the Reconstructionist movement.
And housed with Tree of
mentioned
Life in Squirrel Hill.
Dor Hadash.
Dor Hadash. But that's all part of what would eventually merge into the...
Well, no, they were just, Dor Hadash always rented space. They didn't have their own building. And at the time of the massacre, they were renting space, using the rabbi's study for Torah study on Shabbat morning and other rooms in the
same
building.
facility.
There were 3 congregations that were independent. There were others that merged with Tree of Life.
Right.
And you don't need all of them.
I don't, but it's fascinating.
So as you mentioned, Judith Kaplan had been bat mitzvah, was the original American bat mitzvah. So there was, and if not the first, then the second female rabbi was Reconstructionist, and so there was always a complete egalitarian view. And our Hebrew school was a community-run Hebrew school, not affiliated with any movement. And for the kids who were not in a congregation, they also provided bar and bat mitzvah always. And this was in,
it's interesting to trace how the movements, our movement, Reform movement in particular, grappled with the disparity between recognizing a boy's place in the Jewish community and a girl's place. Obviously, even the most liberal of the Jewish movements, Reform at the time, later I would say Reconstructionist, takes that mantle. But the liberal end of the Jewish spectrum, particularly in America, had different ways of addressing the disparity between boys and girls, where the advent of bat mitzvah was actually not the majority practice, but rather confirmation, or the consolation prize of saying to a young Ann Cohen, well, no, you can't have a bat mitzvah, but you can have a sweet 16. But just as very widespread was the idea of confirmation, which was also a play at assimilating into American society, which was dominantly Protestant. And so it was really an echo or a direct imitation of Protestant worship. As a way also, a lot of these rituals around the teenage years were as much about socialization as they were about religion. And so the idea of confirmation really took root at a very early stage in American Reform Jewish development, so much so that at least for girls, it became a surrogate for bat mitzvah, which was not really ever on the table, and even in many places for boys, that they wouldn't practice bar bat mitzvah, but rather a ritual at 15 or 16, honoring the place of all teenagers in the Jewish community, but also giving them a place where they could, in a safe context, try out their hormonal, new pubescent, developing adolescent selves in a safe social context that was also co-ed, right? So there's a lot about why Reform Judaism confirms that has to do with gender, but there's also a lot about confirmation that does not have to do with gender. But in many, many classical Reform congregations, confirmation predominates, whereas bar mitzvah and certainly bat mitzvah are minority customs, if practiced at all. Mom and dad, and then Ellie's iPad.
I grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, in a Reform congregation, and there were no bat mitzvahs for girls, but there was one of my acquaintances who insisted on it. So she was a real outlier at age 13. So this had to be 1960 with Joshua Haberman as the rabbi, and she had a bat mitzvah. And it was just an astounding thing, I remember.
Yeah, the fact that you remember this, and I don't know if I've heard this story, Mom, suggests that it was a big deal at the time.
It was a big deal.
And I'll bet you it was controversial.
Pardon?
I'll bet you it was controversial.
Yes.
Yes.
She was controversial, though. She was one of the first people that we could say later, came out and identified as being a lesbian. And that didn't come as a great shock to anybody later, but she was really quite insistent on what she wanted, and it was definitely an outlier.
Right. And all of this, by the way, pre-women's lib, pre-feminism, so even more so. Cool story, Mom. And I'm going to isolate also Russell's story. When I visited, he writes, what remains of the Neue Synagogue in Berlin, right? Yeah, what remains. I learned that at the time it was defiled by the Nazis, it had 12 rabbis. It was humongous, true. One of whom was a woman, and not just any woman, but the first woman, Rabbi Regina Jonas, who continued to serve the Jews of Berlin even after they were deported to the camps, where eventually she was murdered. I think at the age of 40, something like that. But she really is identified as the first woman rabbi. And it's a sad irony that it would take another 30 years after her murder for the next female rabbi to be ordained. And that was Sally Priesand,
Right.
who is the mother of the reform of the women in the rabbinate, ordained by Hebrew Union College and specifically by its then president, Alfred Gottschalk, in 1972, which was a revolutionary decision on the part of HUC to begin ordaining women. Erin, please.
First of all, I wanted to thank all of the amazing women in this group for sharing their stories because of women like you, I was privileged to have a traditional and equal bat mitzvah when I was 13. So thank you for that. And going back to the Pirkei Avot passage that you brought up, I find the experience that I have studying with you all here now as a 40-year-old much more meaningful, I think, to me as a Jew than I did that then. And so I just wanted to say thank you and point that out. So thank you all for being part of my 40s where I'm learning to understand.
Hear, hear. And the comments keep coming. What a great conversation we've opened up around this. Okay, we're going to do one more text before today concludes. It's a fun one. So a Midrash from Bereshit Rabbah, again, 5th, 6th century of the Common Era, we think, but probably redacted after anthologizing a whole bunch of material from earlier over many generations, becomes the great collection of Midrash around the book of Genesis. So Bereshit Rabbah literally means the great collection of Midrash on Genesis. And it's a famous story in the Midrash. Again, find it only in the Midrash, but if it's like, oh, I've heard that story before, this may be one of the ones that you've heard. So it's totally timely because it's about, it's derived from this week's Torah portion, which is called Vayetze, which I would describe as the sort of continuing adventures of Jacob and Esau, who were introduced to us as twins last week in Parshat Toldot. So this is on the Toldot Vayetze section of the Torah. You can see actually the citation here is we're playing off of Genesis chapter 25, verse 27, which may have been last week's Parsha. believe that was last week. But again, we're roughly at the same part of the story that we are reading at this time of year. And the text that is being discussed is just two words from Genesis chapter 25, Vayigdelu hane'arim, the words that I've highlighted here, which means the boys grew up. So we're talking about Jacob and Esau and their growing up years. So the boys grew up. And the rabbis are going to ask, well, what do we mean the boys grew up? How do we know that the boys were grown up? What does it look like to grow up as a boy? Rabbi Levi Amar, so Rabbi Levi says, Mashal lehadas, ve'itbonit shayu gdelim ze al gabe ze. Okay, we're going to get into some tricky Hebrew, so I'm actually going to switch down here. The lads grew. And by the way, the rest of the quote is not provided in the Hebrew text above, which is the other reason I wanted us to see it here, but they did give it to us helpfully in the English. Esau was, or I would say became, a man who knows hunting, a man of the field. And Jacob became a simple man. I think simple is probably wrong, but it's the opposite of brawny in this case. So if smooth is actually one valid interpretation of the word that is used in the Hebrew for what kind of a adult Jacob became. So whereas Esau became hairy and brawny, Jacob became smooth, and the implication is that he is an indoor guy. He's a dweller in tents, right? So these concepts are related. It's not simple in the sense of intellectual capacity. Actually, quite the opposite. Jacob is the bookish one. But as opposed to Esau, he's not big and brawny. He's a computer programmer. Okay. Or in this case, we're going to see something not related to computers, but he's studious. The lads grew. All right, so this is the part we're looking at. Sorry, I keep clicking away. The lads grew. Rabbi Levi said, this is analogous to a myrtle. That was the word hadas above. The hadas tree means myrtle. This is analogous to a myrtle and a thorn bush that grew adjacent to each other. So you have these two opposite species of plant growing up side by side. When they grew and blossomed, this one produced its fragrance. The myrtle leaves have a nice fresh fragrance, whereas the other one, no fragrance, it just grows spiky thorns. So all 13 years, and this, of course, is the reason I brought this text. This is another one of those classic texts that is often brought up in discussion of the origin of bar mitzvah. Sidebar. You notice we haven't seen any text that talks about an aliyah to the Torah. We're going to get to that stuff next week. We haven't seen any of the ritual stuff around B'nai Mitzvah. So far, we're really only talking about what qualities of a young person do we associate with this time in their lives, 12 or 13. So all 13 years, both of them would go to school and both of them would come from school. So in other words, they were brought up the same way. After 13 years, this one would go to study halls. That would be Yaakov, Jacob, and that one would go to houses of idol worship.
Wow.
Elazar said, a person must be responsible for his son until age 13, and from there on, he must say, blessed that he has absolved me from the punishment of this one. So I want to go to the Hebrew for this one. The Hebrew for this one is let's see if I can find it. It's a long passage. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Tzarich Adam, okay, lehitapel bivno. A person is responsible for bringing up his child up until Yud Gimel, which is 13, Shana. So Shalosh Esrei Shana, 13 years. Mikan va'elach, here on after, so following that, Tzarich Shiomar, one is obligated to pronounce the following blessing. One says these words, Baruch shepetarani me'onsho shel zeh. Blessed the one who has released me from the punishment of this one. In other words, if my child becomes a screw-up in life, after 13, I, the father, the parent, am relieved of my responsibility. Before then, it's my fault. my kid gets into hot water, it is imputed to me as if I did it myself. After 13, blessed the one who has released me from the punishment of this child. And by the way, I have probably 5 or 10 times in my rabbinate had a parent ask to pronounce this blessing from the bima at their child's bar or bat mitzvah, usually bar.
Whoa.
And I'm like, and they usually say it as a joke, and we have a conversation. I'm like, well, that's the blessing. I said, so if you want to bless your child, that is still the traditional blessing for what you say at a kid's bar mitzvah. You say, Baruch shepetarani me'onsho shel zeh. Blessed the one who has released me from the punishment of this child. I am no longer responsible for how my kid turns out. Now, I am grateful that my parents did not cease their interest in my moral development at age 13, but rather continued it until at least age 51 and 2 months, which would be now. Nevertheless, I think that there's something very, very deep and important going on here, which is the recognition of independent moral agency at the time of bar mitzvah, which I would go on to say is the defining characteristic of bar mitzvah, that one now recognizes that although the child may not be an adult in the fullest sense of the term, and certainly is not accorded all of the rights and privileges pertaining thereto, kids, and we say this to all the time, the old joke, today I am a man, tomorrow I return to the seventh grade. Nevertheless, what is it about a seventh grader that parents should reasonably expect that they would not expect of their sixth grader? Or let's go back to their fifth grader, because we've seen that the sixth grade year, 11 or 12, is interstitial. It's sort of like, well, we're practicing. We're going to make sure the kid can fast at least until lunchtime. We're going to make sure that the kid's vows are still examined, even though we want them to start to internalize the seriousness with which such matters should be taken up. So what's different about a seventh grader or an eighth grader from a fifth grader or a sixth grader? And I'd say the key Jewish answer here is moral agency and therefore responsibility or culpability. Right? That's really what it's about. And the parent can no longer be assumed to be the morally responsible partner in this family once a child reaches this age. So thoughts, comments on that, because that's where we're going to. I got a very funny private comment from my parents. I'm not going to share it but it has to do with my sister. Okay, so it's a private comment. Anyone want to comment here, particularly from the standpoint, perhaps of parenthood or childhood? Mom and dad, yeah, please. Yeah, unmute. Your hand went up. Nope, mom and dad, do you have a comment? You don't. Okay.
We seem to have moved past that in American jurisprudence, holding parents now, criminally liable for the action of their adolescent children.
That was the landmark case from a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, of the Michigan parents who were found criminally liable in the case of a school shooting perpetrated by their son. Older than the age of bar mitzvah, though not many, many years, I think 15 or 16, perpetrated a horrific, I think, a mass shooting. And the parents were found criminally negligent in providing their child with the firearm. Yep. Certainly different understandings, I think, around what is the age of maturity. When should kids go to juvie as opposed to, federal prison for incarceration? These are really important, very much alive questions. And even in the Jewish community with much lower stakes, there has long been a conversation among my colleagues in the reform movement proposing that maybe we should do bar and bat mitzvah at 16, because we really think that kids of 13 lack significant enough moral development to proclaim you're now a bar mitzvah. I favor that Jewish tradition should find ways of affirming sequentially different stages of a child's development, so bar mitzvah and confirmation as opposed to bar mitzvah or confirmation. And one thing we're debating right now as a clergy team is moving confirmation to the end of 12th grade. So something we've been talking about a little bit, but I think we might pounce on that in the next year or two. I think that there's something to be said for I'm going to say a lot of things about this eventually, but we've noticed an emotional and moral regression of kids over the last many years. I think COVID amplified and accelerated that trend, both of intellectual, emotional, and moral development. So that kids of 13 and 14 today, seventh, eighth, ninth graders, strike me and my clergy colleagues as less independent, less emotionally resilient, less morally independent than the generation that came before them. I'm going to go out on a limb and say with much compassion, I think that is linked. I think it's multifactorial. I think some of it is parenting norms, which are evolving always. Some of it is just generational, what's in the water, but a lot of it is trauma linked, in my view. But again, I'm saying this with a lot of humility as the rabbi who observes this without the same investment of the parents in our community. And I say it as a person who wants to present as a partner to the parents in our community in helping raise their children to be nice Jewish kids and nice Jewish adults. But I do think that I have observed some significant changes in kids' moral, emotional, and intellectual development that definitely they don't always keep me up at night, but they definitely get me up in the morning. Other comments? We have a few hands up, and then we'll conclude our study. Audrey, first, please.
Well, I wanted to agree with everything that you said,
I
but
hope you don't agree with everything I said. But
well,
okay.
I actually did. Unfortunately, it seems that parents expect the schools to raise children today, as opposed, I mean, Richard and I always discuss this, like, and I was originally going to say, if you're not responsible for your child's moral development, where is it supposed to come from? And that seems to jive with what you've observed. But also, I I was confirmed at the end of ninth grade here, WRT, and there were three of us who continued through 12th grade with Rabbi Stern one night a week, and those were phenomenal years. So I think that if you move it later, I mean, I'm trying to encourage my granddaughter to keep going. I don't know where that'll go, but it becomes so much more meaningful and fun
I
to keep
completely
going.
agree. But around on the table where I'm sitting in my office last night, we filled the table around with a wonderful group of 11th and 12th graders, and we did an Ask Me Anything night, but we ended up inverting it. I said, okay, like I didn't prepare a lesson plan. I didn't tell them that I didn't prepare a lesson plan. I just said my intention tonight was that we would just you can ask me anything, and instead. I and our Israeli emissary, who's 19, Anita, ended up asking the kids everything. And we had the most amazing conversation with the kids about how are they experiencing anti-Semitism. A couple of them voted in the presidential election and wanted to talk about that. Like we had the best conversation. And I think that, again, intellectually and emotionally, if not morally, kids of that age in particular are now at a real place where they can talk, think, and respond like adults. Yeah,
Right.
it's cool. Yep. Aaron. I keep seeing Ellie.
First of all, if it's my kids causing the problem, I hope you'll tell me.
I will.
Second of all,
No, but I will.
this passage really spoke to me as a parent who's experiencing this transition now. Ellie, like it makes me think of like letting them make their own decisions and giving them more independence, and that transition from no, you can't go to the park on your own to yes, you can go to the park on your own. Or Ellie got an iPhone and I told her I had to have access to it so I could check everything. And then when do I check and do I check, and like how much freedom am I going to give them? Because they have to be able to mature and become independent and make good choices on their own. And how do they learn to make good choices on their own unless they make bad choices and learn from them?
By the way, you've prompted me to add something that I think about a lot, which is that I think that the moral landscape is vastly more complicated today. And that largely is because of the interconnectedness that is provided by social media. Like the access that kids have to stuff that is, well, let's just say that would run their development in a direction counter to the ways that parents want their kids to develop morally is vastly more open than it used to be. Like kids just have access to information that is really bad these days, and not just information, but content. Content is the word that's used in the media universe.
But I feel a personal responsibility if my kids are the ones misbehaving in JLL, and at some point it's not going to be. And it just really spoke to me as someone who's going through that transition.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think the leadership of the JLL, of which of course I'm included, and Rabbi Citrin, we struggle with this because we also find that parents are much more resistant to critical feedback about their kids' behavior. We often find that this did not happen a generation ago, that if the principal calls the parents and says your kid was a real terror in Hebrew school, the parents would say, "Oh, please spank them harder for me." I once had a kid who was like really driving me nuts, and I called the parents and they said, I'm going to stop you right there. Whatever you saw my kid doing, I'm sure it was that bad and worse. Now that would not happen today. Like if I have to like put on armor and say, look, I want to talk to you, Dr. So-and-so about your kid. They're like, the defensiveness is just massive. My kid couldn't do anything wrong. It must be you, Rabbi.
But the flip side is I don't feel like I actually get honest feedback, because anytime I talk to a teacher, they're hesitant to tell me anything.
Yeah, I know that we're not the only ones who feel a little bit cowed by this generational phenomenon. Thank you, Aaron. Sandy?
Yes. Talking about the ages in Judaism, of moral responsibility and recognition by age. As you know, some people may know, I'm a retired family court judge, and one of the areas of jurisdiction in the family court is what is called juvenile delinquency, which is criminal law in the adult court. So children, even for most egregious crime, but because of their age, are tried in family court. And then in certain of the crimes, based on the age, there's level of degrees of conduct and punishment. So the court is recognizing that in a way related to what we're talking about.
That's right. And thank you for your service in such a difficult and often heartbreaking field of law.
Thank you. It sure was.
Yep. Last comment goes to Anne, please.
I don't know if I'm the only one thinking this, but I think sexual development and conducting yourself correctly when it comes to sex, and also young children also are going through sexual development. They may not even understand it.
Right.
Because I didn't when I was growing up, and I had nobody to talk to.
Right.
And I think that this is one of the things that should be discussed with the kids.
Yeah, and I think that again, I from what I understand, the Scarsdale schools and most of the schools in this part of the world actually are being very responsive to that. They're also responsive to the fact that unfortunately kids have access to sexually explicit material at a much younger age. It's just much more widespread. And so kids, quote unquote, learn about sex in ways that are actually really invidious to the ways in which we as parents or a Jewish community would want them to learn this important part of human development and what it means to form loving bonds of relationships that are rooted in morality and Jewish values. So we've got a lot of work to do. What an interesting conversation we've had, as we always do. Next week we'll, I think, probably complete our consideration of bar and bat mitzvah, and we'll move on from there. And we've got a long form unit that's going to begin about marriage and family law in Jewish tradition. I'm going to make two quick announcements next week as well, but we have two wonderful mini mesters coming up this winter. One that will be taught by Rabbi Jan Katsu, and one of our educators at the temple, Noam Vineker-Meinrat, who's Israeli. They're going to do a 4-week dive into the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which is going to be fascinating. It's the same Zoom time. It's 10:15. I'm not sure if it's the same Zoom address, but it's 10:15 on Thursday starting in January. And then in February, Rabbi Alyssa Platkow, our new assistant rabbi, is going to teach a class on texts and traditions around Jewish death and mourning. So we're going to do 2 4-week mini mesters in the winter, January and February. And then when we get to March, Cantor Kleinman, with me a little bit, is going to teach about the Passover Haggadah. And then I'm going to rejoin in the late winter, early spring, for our long-form spring learning, which will resume this arc of study. But we've still got 2 more weeks to go, the 12th and the 19th of December. So happy Kislev and an early Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Shalom. Thank you.
What a great bunch of fellow seminarians, Rabbi. Terrific. Thank you all.
You all chose to be here. Thank you.